Hey there, deep diver. Today we're going deep as a philosopher into feminist perspectives on sex markets.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, we're talking about pornography and prostitution.
Okay,
Those really tricky areas where like philosophy and reality kind of collide.
for sure.
We've got some fascinating source material today from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to unpack,
Nice.
exploring how feminist thinkers have grappled with the ethics and the power dynamics,
Yeah.
and even like what it means to be human in these contexts.
Yeah,
Are you ready to navigate this tricky terrain?
absolutely. This topic is so important. It's about more than just like personal opinions, you know?
Yeah,
It's about understanding the very structures of our society.
exactly. We're not here to shy away from the hard questions.
Right.
We're going to tackle the ethical dilemmas,
Mm.
the social impact, and even the varying viewpoints within feminism itself.
Okay.
So get ready for a deep dive that will make you think differently about these issues.
I'm ready.
Okay, so why are sex markets such a hotbed of debate, especially from feminist perspectives?
They sit at this intersection of morality, economics, and freedom of expression.
Right.
And for many feminists, the big concern is harm. The potential harm to women,
Okay.
both individually and as a group,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. And the Stanford Encyclopedia really digs into those concerns,
It does.
discussing the potential for exploitation,
Uh-huh.
power imbalances, and the implications for gender equality overall.
For sure.
And they focus on two main areas,
Mhm.
pornography and prostitution.
Exactly. And it's important to note that even within feminism,
Yeah.
you have a diverse range of viewpoints on these issues.
Right.
It's not a monolithic block.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit.
Okay.
The encyclopedia highlights why feminists often single out pornography for critique.
Yes.
What makes it different from other forms of media?
Well, one argument is that pornography, perhaps more so than other media, has this unique power to shape our attitudes
Right.
and desires about gender and sexuality. The source mentions philosopher Anne Eaton,
Okay.
who argues that inegalitarian pornography can actually reinforce harmful stereotypes about women
Yeah.
and their roles in society. It's not just depicting something, it's actively contributing to the normalization of those harmful views.
So as a philosopher, you could say it's performing a kind of illocutionary act,
Yes.
to borrow a term from speech act theory.
Right.
It's not just representing reality, it's actually doing something in the world.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia even traces how feminist engagement with pornography has evolved historically.
Yeah.
It talks about the shift from second-wave feminism, which took a strong anti-pornography stance in the 1960s and 70s,
Right.
to the emergence of third-wave feminism in the 90s, which often embraces a more sex-positive perspective.
So we're seeing like a real evolution in feminist thought here.
Uh-huh.
But those core concerns about power and representation remain.
Absolutely. And one of the most powerful arguments against pornography is this idea that it can actually silence and subordinate women.
Now that's a tricky one.
Yeah.
How can something visual like pornography actually silence someone?
It gets into some pretty complex philosophical territory.
Okay.
Delving into speech act theory, the source mentions Ray Langton and Jennifer Hornsby, who argue that pornography can warp the meaning of women's communication, particularly their refusals.
So let me see if I understand this.
Okay.
Because of how women are often portrayed in pornography,
Yeah.
their no might not be interpreted as a genuine refusal.
Right.
Like their ability to perform the speech act of refusal is undermined by the context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It creates this culture where women's voices, particularly when it comes to consent, are systematically misread or discounted.
Right.
And this has serious implications for legal responsibility and consent in real-life situations.
Wow. So we're talking about a potential breakdown in the very conditions of possibility for meaningful communication.
Yes.
It's almost like pornography creates a kind of alternative reality with its own warped rules of language.
That's a very insightful way to put it.
Yeah.
But the encyclopedia also points out counter-arguments to this silencing claim.
Okay.
It mentions legal scholar Nadine Strawson,
Okay.
who challenges the idea that pornography has one single authoritative meaning.
So it's not like a mathematical equation where every viewer gets the same result.
Right. Strawson argues that people can interpret pornography in diverse ways,
Okay.
some of which might even be empowering.
Interesting.
She emphasizes the importance of individual interpretation.
So even with a visual medium like pornography,
Yeah.
the viewer isn't just passively absorbing, meaning they're actively constructing it
Uh-huh.
based on their own experiences and perspectives.
Exactly. Now, the encyclopedia also dives into another major philosophical concern: sexual objectification.
Okay.
It brings in Immanuel Kant's concept of treating people as ends in themselves
Okay.
and how it relates to pornography.
Kant, the categorical imperative and all that.
Yeah.
But how does that apply to sexual objectification in pornography?
The argument is that pornography often portrays women in a way that reduces them to objects,
Right.
mere instruments for male pleasure. It denies them their full humanity and agency, which goes directly against Kant's idea of respecting each person's inherent dignity.
So we could say it's treating a person as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves.
Precisely. But as with everything in philosophy, it's not a simple black and white issue.
Right.
The encyclopedia brings in philosopher Martha Nussbaum,
Okay.
who offers a more nuanced perspective on objectification.
Okay.
She distinguishes between morally problematic forms of objectification and those that might be acceptable within certain contexts.
Interesting.
Uh-huh.
So not all forms of objectification are inherently bad.
Right. Nussbaum argues that it depends on the specific actions and the overall context of the relationship. For example, in a romantic relationship, partners might at times treat each other as passive or focus on certain bodily aspects, but there's still mutual respect and a recognition of each other's full subjectivity.
So for Nussbaum, the key is whether the objectification denies someone's autonomy or their status as a full person.
Exactly. And while Nussbaum acknowledges that some forms of objectification can be acceptable,
Right.
she argues that a lot of mainstream pornography does cross that line.
Okay.
She criticizes it for portraying a kind of fungibility of sex partners where women are seen as interchangeable objects rather than unique individuals.
That gets to the heart of the feminist concern about how pornography might impact our understanding of women as full persons deserving of respect.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that Nussbaum, while critical of pornography, doesn't necessarily advocate for legal censorship.
Okay.
Like many feminist philosophers, she believes these issues are best addressed through dialogue, cultural critique, and a deeper understanding of ethical implications.
So it's about changing hearts and minds, not necessarily resorting to legal restrictions.
Precisely. Now, the encyclopedia doesn't just present the anti-pornography perspective.
Right.
It also explores this concept of feminist pornography, which might seem like a contradiction in terms.
Feminist pornography. I have to admit, that sounds like an oxymoron.
It does, doesn't it?
How can something often seen as exploitative be feminist?
Well, that's exactly the challenge feminist pornographers are trying to address.
Okay.
The source mentions thinkers like Judith Butler and Drusilla Cornell,
Okay.
who argue for the importance of diverse representations of sexuality and the potential of fantasy to challenge norms.
So are they trying to create pornography that doesn't rely on those harmful power dynamics and stereotypes we've been discussing?
Exactly. The idea is to create pornography that centers female pleasure,
Okay.
eroticizes egalitarian relationships, and explores sexuality in a way that's empowering and respectful to all involved.
Yeah.
It's about reclaiming the power of representation and challenging the male gaze that dominates mainstream pornography.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia mentions the work of contemporary feminist pornographers who are actually putting these ideas into practice.
It's a reminder that even within a realm like pornography, there's space for subversion, for challenging the status quo and exploring new ways of depicting sexuality that align with feminist values.
Okay, so we've explored some of the complex debates surrounding pornography.
We have.
And it's clear that this goes way beyond just prurient interest.
For sure.
There are some deep philosophical issues at play here.
Definitely.
But what about prostitution?
Yeah,
The encyclopedia tackles that as well, right?
absolutely.
Okay.
And it's just as nuanced and challenging, if not more so.
All right, well, let's dive into that moral maze then.
Okay.
I'm ready for the next challenge.
Let's go. Welcome back to our deep dive into feminist perspectives on sex markets.
It's heavy stuff, but also really engaging. As a philosopher, I'm starting to see how these issues connect to so many different branches of philosophy, like ethics, political philosophy, even aesthetics when we're talking about representation.
Exactly. These debates force us to think about fundamental concepts like autonomy, freedom, and the nature of the good life.
So picking up where we left off, we're starting to talk about different policy approaches to prostitution.
Okay.
The encyclopedia mentions the Swedish model, the Dutch model, and the New Zealand model.
Right.
Can we break those down a bit further?
Absolutely. Let's start with the Swedish model, sometimes called the Nordic model.
Okay.
This approach criminalizes the purchase of sex, but not the selling of sex.
So instead of punishing the sex workers,
Yeah.
they're going after the clients, the ones creating the demand.
Exactly.
It's an interesting approach focusing on changing behavior rather than just criminalizing the act itself.
Right. The argument is that this helps reduce exploitation by making it riskier and less appealing for clients. It also sends a message that purchasing sex is morally wrong and socially unacceptable.
But I imagine there are criticisms of this model as well.
There are.
It doesn't sound like it would address the underlying reasons why someone might enter sex work in the first place. Things like poverty, lack of opportunity, or even past trauma.
You're absolutely right. That's a common critique.
Yeah.
Some argue that the Swedish model simply drives prostitution further underground,
Okay.
making it harder for sex workers to access support services and potentially putting them at greater risk.
So it might have these unintended consequences that actually harm the very people it's intended to protect.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the ethics of consequences versus intentions.
A classic philosophical dilemma.
For sure.
Now let's contrast that with the Dutch model, which takes a completely different route.
Okay.
This model legalizes and regulates prostitution, bringing it out into the open with government oversight.
So it's like saying, okay, this exists. Let's try to make it as safe and ethical as possible by creating a clear legal framework.
Yeah.
It's almost like treating it as a legitimate business with rules and regulations.
Exactly. The Netherlands has a system where sex workers can obtain licenses,
Okay.
work in designated areas, and access healthcare and benefits.
Right.
The idea is that this reduces harm by increasing transparency and accountability.
Okay.
It also allows for better monitoring to prevent exploitation and trafficking.
So the focus is on harm reduction rather than trying to eliminate prostitution entirely.
Yeah,
It's a more pragmatic approach, perhaps.
right. But the Dutch model has its critics, too.
I imagine so.
Some argue that legalization doesn't actually reduce the stigma attached to sex work
Okay.
and might even lead to the industry expanding, potentially drawing more people into prostitution.
So it doesn't really address the moral concerns of those who see the selling of sex itself as inherently wrong,
Right.
regardless of the conditions.
That's right. And then there's the New Zealand model, which represents perhaps the most liberal approach of the three.
Okay.
This model fully decriminalizes sex work, removing all criminal penalties for both buying and selling sex between consenting adults.
Wow, that's a big step.
It is.
It's essentially saying this is a private transaction between adults and the government should stay out of it.
Right.
It's a pretty radical application of the harm principle, you could say.
Definitely, New Zealand's approach is grounded in the belief that decriminalization is the best way to protect sex workers' rights,
Okay.
reduce stigma, and empower them to advocate for themselves.
So it's like treating sex work like any other form of labor, subject to the same employment laws and regulations.
Exactly.
But I'm guessing this approach is also the most controversial.
It is.
It challenges a lot of deeply held beliefs about the nature of sex and morality.
Absolutely. It's been criticized by those who worry about increased trafficking and exploitation,
Okay.
and by those with moral objections to prostitution, regardless of the legal framework.
It seems like we're really getting down to fundamental philosophical questions here
Right.
about the role of the state in regulating morality, the nature of consent, and how we balance individual freedom with potential harm.
You're right on the mark. The Stanford Encyclopedia dives into these deeper philosophical issues, too.
Okay.
It presents arguments from those who believe that commodifying sex is inherently problematic no matter what,
Interesting.
even with consent or regulation.
So it's not just about the practical concerns of harm,
Right.
but about something more fundamental to the nature of sex itself.
Exactly. One key objection is that selling sex inherently reduces human beings to mere commodities,
Okay.
undermining their dignity and worth. The source mentions philosopher Elizabeth Anderson,
Yeah.
who argues that sex should ideally be a shared good
Right.
based on mutual reciprocity and a kind of offering of the self.
So it's not a service like getting a haircut or hiring a plumber.
It's different.
It has a different kind of moral weight because it involves something so fundamental to our being.
That's the argument Anderson suggests, that commodifying sex destroys that reciprocity and undermines the deeper meaning and value of sexual intimacy. It's like taking something sacred and turning it into a mere transaction.
But wouldn't someone who supports decriminalization argue that even if there's an ideal way to approach sex, the state shouldn't prohibit other forms of sexual expression or exchange between consenting adults.
Yeah.
Isn't that overstepping the boundaries of individual liberty?
That's a valid point, and it gets right to the heart of the debate about the limits of state power.
Right.
John Stuart Mill's harm principle comes to mind here, but the encyclopedia also highlights arguments about how prostitution might impact non-commercial intimate relationships.
Okay, so what's the concern there?
Well,
That the existence of prostitution somehow taints or devalues other forms of sexual relationships.
that's one way to put it. Some argue that it reinforces a view of women as primarily sexual objects.
Okay.
Even in non-commercial contexts,
Right.
it can contribute to this broader culture of objectification and commodification that undermines genuine intimacy and respect.
So it's not just about the individual transaction. It's about the potential ripple effects on our cultural understanding of sex and relationships.
Exactly. Now, the encyclopedia also presents counter-arguments to this view.
Okay.
It mentions philosopher Laurie Schrage,
Okay.
who has written extensively on these topics.
Right.
Schrage challenges the notion that prostitution is inherently degrading,
Okay.
or that it necessarily harms women as a group.
Right.
She argues that these claims often rely on outdated stereotypes and fail to acknowledge the diverse experiences of sex workers.
So it's about moving beyond these generalizations and acknowledging the individual agency and diverse experiences of the people involved.
Right.
It's a bit like Sartre's idea that existence precedes essence.
Yeah,
We can't define people by some pre-existing category or assumption.
that's a great philosophical connection. Schrage points out that many of the concerns raised about prostitution, like exploitation or coercion, can also be present in other types of work or relationships. She argues that it's not prostitution itself that's the problem, but rather broader societal issues like inequality, poverty, and lack of opportunity
Okay.
that might lead someone to choose sex work in the first place.
So it's about addressing those systemic issues rather than simply condemning the individuals who are trying to survive within a system that often stacks the deck against them.
Right, and Schrage challenges the idea that prostitution inherently undermines women's sexual autonomy.
Okay, I'm struggling with that one.
Yeah.
How can someone who's selling sex be considered sexually autonomous?
Okay.
It seems like the ultimate surrender of control over one's body and sexuality.
Well, Schrage distinguishes between different ways of alienating a right or good, including the right to sexual autonomy.
Okay.
She argues that sex workers, like other workers, typically only alienate their right to control their body and labor in a weak sense.
Okay.
They can withdraw from their work contracts at any time.
So it's more like entering into a temporary conditional agreement rather than permanently giving up one's autonomy. It's like selling your labor for a certain period, but you retain the right to quit if the conditions become unacceptable.
Right, and this aligns with the arguments of many sex worker activists who advocate for decriminalization
Okay.
and the recognition of sex work as legitimate labor.
Yeah.
They argue that criminalizing prostitution actually undermined sexual autonomy by denying consenting adults the right to engage in this form of exchange.
So it's a really complex web of arguments,
It is.
with both sides raising valid points about individual rights, social harms, and the role of the state. It's like we're trying to untangle a Gordian knot of moral and political dilemmas.
That's a great analogy, and the Stanford Encyclopedia delves into the historical and cultural factors that have shaped our understanding of prostitution as well.
Okay.
It mentions Gerda Lerner's work,
Okay.
which traces the roots of prostitution back to ancient societies and highlights how it often stemmed from the enslavement and exploitation of women.
So the argument is that prostitution has always been intertwined with patriarchal power structures and the subordination of women.
That's one interpretation.
It's like this enduring legacy of oppression that continues to shape our perceptions and policies today.
That's one way to look at it. The source also discusses Gail Rubin's work,
Okay.
which links the rise of prostitution to early kinship systems where women were exchanged as gifts between men to solidify social bonds.
Wow. So the argument is that the very foundations of society were built on a kind of trafficking of women.
It is a bold claim.
That's a pretty radical claim.
It is, and it suggests that prostitution isn't just a modern phenomenon,
Right.
but rather a deeply ingrained aspect of human history and social organization.
Yeah.
It's like this recurring theme that keeps popping up in different forms across cultures and time periods.
But I imagine there are criticisms of these historical analyses as well.
There are.
It can't be as simple as saying all forms of prostitution throughout history have been driven solely by male domination.
Right.
There must have been other factors at play as well.
You're right to be cautious about oversimplifying complex historical phenomena.
Yeah.
The source acknowledges that these accounts tend to focus on the subordination of women
Right.
and might overlook other factors, such as the enslavement and prostitution of men, that has also occurred throughout history.
So any comprehensive understanding of prostitution needs to take into account a whole range of historical and cultural contexts, as well as the diverse experiences and motivations of the people involved.
Right.
It's not a monolithic phenomenon.
Exactly. And the encyclopedia even challenges the notion that all forms of prostitution are inherently harmful or exploitative.
Okay.
It brings in Martha Nussbaum again,
Okay.
who argues that the stigma associated with sex work is often based on male sexuality.
So she's suggesting that our negative view of prostitution might be more about societal taboos than any inherent harm.
That's a key part of her argument. She compares it to other professions that were once heavily stigmatized, such as acting or singing, which were seen as forms of prostitution in the past.
It's fascinating how our perceptions of work and respectability change over time.
It is.
What was once considered scandalous can become completely mainstream.
Right, and Nussbaum argues that we should challenge the stigma surrounding sex work rather than simply assuming it's inherently degrading or harmful.
Okay.
She even pushes back against some common arguments against prostitution.
What are some of those arguments and how does she address them?
Well, one common argument is that prostitution is inherently risky and dangerous for sex workers.
Yeah.
But Nussbaum points out that many jobs involve risks,
Right.
and the level of risk in prostitution often depends on the specific context and working conditions.
So it's not necessarily more dangerous than, say, construction work or mining, which are also male-dominated professions and often involve physical risks.
That's her point. Another argument is that sex workers lack autonomy and are essentially forced into prostitution.
Okay.
But Nussbaum argues that many jobs involve constraints on autonomy, and that the level of agency a sex worker has can vary depending on factors like their legal status, working conditions, and personal circumstances.
So again, it's about recognizing the nuances and complexities of the industry, rather than making blanket statements about all sex workers being victims.
Exactly.
We need to avoid those kinds of essentialist claims that erase individual agency and experience.
Right, and she goes on to address arguments about how prostitution might harm non-commercial relationships,
Okay.
violate a person's inherent right to their sexuality, and contribute to male domination.
Right.
In each case, she challenges the assumption that these harms are inherent to prostitution and argues they often depend on the specific social context and the way the industry is structured.
It's impressive how she systematically dismantles these common arguments by showing how they often rely on faulty assumptions or ignore the broader context. It's a great example of how philosophical analysis can help us think more critically about complex social issues.
It really is. But
Yeah.
if we move beyond these assumptions about inherent harm, does that mean we should just fully decriminalize prostitution and let the market run its course?
That's the big question, isn't
This
it?
is.
And I'm guessing the answer is not so simple.
You're right. The encyclopedia highlights concerns from those who worry that full decriminalization could lead to an increase in trafficking and exploitation,
Okay.
especially of vulnerable populations. It's like the classic utilitarian dilemma. How do we maximize happiness and well-being for the greatest number of people while minimizing harm?
It's a tough one. How do we balance the rights of sex workers with the need to protect those who might be most at risk?
That's the million-dollar question. The source mentions Scott Anderson,
Okay.
who argues that normalizing prostitution undermines a person's right to sexual autonomy, which is a core value for many feminists.
Wait, but didn't we just discuss how Schrage argued that prostitution doesn't necessarily violate sexual autonomy?
We did.
I'm getting a bit lost in the back and forth here.
I understand it's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah.
Anderson acknowledges that all jobs involve some constraints on autonomy, but he believes that sexual autonomy should be valued differently from other forms of autonomy.
Okay, so what makes sexual autonomy so special?
Okay.
Why does it deserve this higher level of protection?
He argues that a person's sexuality is central to their identity, self-conception, and social standing.
Okay.
Having control over one's sexual choices is essential for human flourishing.
Right.
It's like this foundational aspect of our being that shapes how we experience and relate to the world.
So it's about More than just the physical act itself.
Mm-hmm.
It's about how those choices shape our sense of self and our place in the world. It
Yeah.
connects to our deepest values and aspirations.
Exactly. And he worries that even with consent, selling sex might involve a kind of alienation of one's sexual self
Okay.
that goes beyond the typical compromises we make in other forms of work.
Right.
It's like we're compromising a core part of who we are, not just our time or labor.
That's a thought-provoking argument. But how do we reconcile this concern for sexual autonomy with the arguments of sex worker activists who see decriminalization as the best way to protect their rights and agency?
Yeah.
It's like we're caught between these two competing values, freedom and protection.
It's a tough balancing act. The source mentions Hallie Liberto,
Okay.
who responds to Anderson's concerns by distinguishing between different ways of alienating a right.
Okay.
She argues that sex workers, like other workers, typically only temporarily waive their right to control their body, and labor not permanently relinquish it.
So it's about the degree and duration of the alienation, not a complete surrender of autonomy. It's
Yeah.
like the difference between renting your apartment and selling it outright.
Exactly. And she points out that in a society where forced labor is prohibited,
Okay.
workers have the right to withdraw from their contracts, even if it means losing certain benefits.
Right.
This applies to all kinds of work, not just sex work.
So it's about ensuring that sex workers have the same rights and protections as other workers, including the right to quit a job they no longer want to do without fear of punishment.
Right, and this leads us to the broader question of how we can effectively regulate sex markets, if at all.
Okay.
To balance the rights of sex workers with the need to prevent exploitation and harm, it's a thorny problem that requires careful consideration of all the ethical, legal, and social implications.
Okay, so what are some of the specific challenges and considerations when it comes to regulating prostitution?
One challenge is distinguishing between voluntary and forced prostitution.
Yeah.
The source highlights the complex relationship between human trafficking and consensual sex work,
Okay.
recognizing that there are often blurred lines between the two.
Yeah, it's not always easy to tell whether someone is freely choosing to engage in sex work or being coerced into it.
It's difficult.
There can be subtle forms of pressure or manipulation that make it difficult to determine true consent.
Exactly. And this makes it difficult to craft policies that effectively target trafficking without criminalizing those who are engaging in consensual sex work.
Right.
The source mentions Kamala Kepedu,
Okay.
who challenges traditional feminist views of prostitution as solely a product of male domination.
Yeah.
She argues that these views often overlook the agency of sex workers, especially women of color,
Yeah.
and the complex social and economic factors that might lead them to choose sex work as a livelihood.
So it's about recognizing the diversity of experiences within the sex trade and not treating all sex workers as helpless victims.
Exactly.
It's about acknowledging their agency and understanding the complex web of factors that shape their choices.
Right, and she advocates for a more nuanced understanding of prostitution as a form of labor,
Okay.
subject to the same concerns about working conditions, exploitation, and worker rights as any other industry.
It's about applying the same ethical standards and principles of fairness that we would apply to any other type of work. It's interesting to think about prostitution through the lens of labor rights
Yeah.
and the need to ensure safe and fair working conditions for everyone, regardless of their profession. It shifts the focus from morality to material conditions and basic human rights.
Right, and this perspective challenges the traditional view of prostitution as inherently immoral or degrading.
Okay.
It shifts the focus to the material conditions of sex workers and the need to address the social and economic inequalities that might make them vulnerable to exploitation.
So if we're thinking about regulating prostitution, what are some of the specific policy options and debates that arise?
Well, one debate revolves around the issue of mandatory licensing and health checks for sex workers.
Okay.
Some argue that these measures are necessary to protect public health and prevent the spread of sexually transmitted infections.
That sounds reasonable on the surface,
It does.
but I imagine there are concerns about those measures as well.
Yes.
It seems like it could create a kind of double standard, holding sex workers to a higher level of scrutiny than other professions.
You're right. Some sex worker activists argue that mandatory licensing and health checks can be intrusive, stigmatizing,
Right.
and create barriers to entry that might push sex workers further underground.
Yeah.
They argue that these measures often target sex workers themselves, rather than addressing the root causes of health risks,
Okay.
such as poverty, lack of access to health care, and criminalization, which can make it more difficult for sex workers to report violence or seek help.
So it's about finding a balance between protecting public health and respecting the rights and agency of sex workers.
Yes.
It's like the classic tension between individual liberty and the common good.
Exactly. And there are debates about other aspects of regulation as well,
Okay.
such as zoning laws that restrict where sex work can take place and the legality of brothels versus independent sex work. Some argue that brothels can provide a safer environment for sex workers,
Okay.
while others worry that they concentrate power in the hands of managers and increase the risk of exploitation.
It sounds like there's no easy answer, and that any attempt to regulate prostitution will involve trade-offs and potential unintended consequences.
Yeah.
It's like trying to solve a complex equation with multiple variables. You adjust one thing, and it affects everything else.
That's a great analogy, and it's important to consider the voices and experiences of sex workers themselves in these policy debates.
Absolutely. Their perspectives are crucial for understanding the realities of the industry and crafting regulations that actually improve their lives rather than further marginalizing them. It's about ensuring their voices are heard and their rights are respected.
Well said. And the encyclopedia highlights the work of several sex worker activists and organizations that have emerged to advocate for decriminalization and the recognition of sex worker rights.
Can you tell us more about the sex workers' rights movement and the arguments they're making?
Sure, the source mentions Carol Lee,
Oh.
who has been a prominent voice in the movement, as well as organizations like the Prostitutes Education Network and the Global Network of Sex Work Projects. These groups challenge the dominant narrative of sex workers as victims and argue that criminalization actually makes them more vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and discrimination.
So they're pushing back against the idea that all sex workers need to be rescued or that the industry should be abolished.
Exactly.
It's about recognizing their agency and allowing them to speak for themselves.
Right. They argue that sex work can be a legitimate form of labor and that sex workers deserve the same rights and protections as other workers.
Okay.
They advocate for decriminalization, access to healthcare freedom from violence and harassment, and the ability to organize and advocate for themselves.
It's inspiring to see how they're fighting for their rights and challenging the stigma that surrounds their profession.
Yeah.
It's like they're reclaiming their own narrative and demanding to be seen as full human beings with dignity and agency.
Absolutely. And their work highlights the importance of listening to the voices of those who are most affected by these policies.
Right.
And ensuring that their perspectives are included in the debate.
So it seems like we've come full circle back to the importance of respecting the agency and autonomy of all individuals involved,
Yeah.
whether they're sex workers, clients, or those who hold moral objections to prostitution.
You've got it. And the encyclopedia reminds us that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to these complex issues.
Right.
Any attempt to regulate sex markets will involve difficult ethical choices and trade-offs.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to engage in open and honest dialogue considering a range of perspectives and experiences.
Right.
It's not about finding the right answer,
Yeah.
but rather about engaging in this ongoing process of ethical deliberation and seeking solutions that minimize harm and maximize well-being for everyone involved.
This deep dive has certainly challenged my thinking about sex work.
Uh-huh.
What strikes me is how much of this conversation is about power dynamics and social justice,
Yeah.
rather than just individual choices or morality.
Right.
It's about understanding how our social structures and systems create conditions that make certain groups more vulnerable to exploitation and harm.
Absolutely. And the encyclopedia highlights the work of feminists who are analyzing prostitution through the lens of neoliberal and neocolonial economic relationships. It mentions Laura Agustin,
Okay.
who cautions against conflating voluntary migrant sex workers with those who are trafficked.
That distinction is really important.
Yeah.
It's not always clear-cut, and we have to be careful about generalizations.
Right. And the source mentions Prabha Kodeswaran,
Okay.
who advocates for a middle ground feminist approach to prostitution.
Okay.
She calls for a nuanced understanding that takes into account the empirical realities of the industry,
Right.
the agency of sex workers, and the need to find solutions that protect their rights and well-being.
I like that idea of finding a middle ground that balances competing concerns and values.
Yeah.
It seems like a more pragmatic and compassionate approach than taking an absolute stance on either side of the debate.
I agree, and it recognizes that there are no easy answers when it comes to sex markets. It's a reminder that we need to engage in these conversations with humility, open-mindedness, and a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on prostitution.
We have.
Are there any other key insights from the Stanford Encyclopedia that we should touch on before we wrap up this deep dive? It feels like we've just scratched the surface of this topic. You know, even after all this discussion.
It's true. It's true.
There's so much to consider
Yeah.
from like philosophical, ethical, and social perspectives.
These are issues that have been debated for centuries, and there's no easy resolution in sight. But that's what makes them so fascinating to explore.
Speaking of exploring, the Stanford Encyclopedia also challenges us to examine our own assumptions and biases about sex work.
Yes.
It's not just about analyzing the arguments of others.
Right.
It's about turning that critical lens inward as well.
Absolutely. And the source brings in some really interesting perspectives on that. It mentions philosopher Nancy Bauer,
Okay.
who draws on Simone de Beauvoir's ideas about the social construction of femininity.
De Beauvoir, that's a name every philosopher knows.
For sure.
The Second Sex, a foundational text in feminist thought.
Yeah.
What's Bauer's take on this in relation to sex work?
Well, he suggests that women are not simply passive victims of objectification.
Right.
They also play a role in shaping their own objectification, internalizing those societal norms and expectations.
That's a bold claim.
Yeah.
It sounds like she's walking a fine line between acknowledging the harmful effects of sexism and objectification while also recognizing the agency of women in navigating those systems.
Exactly. It's not about blaming women or downplaying the harms, but about understanding the complexity of these issues. It's a reminder that even as we challenge oppressive systems, we're also shaped by them in ways we might not always be aware of. It's like we're both subjects and objects within those systems.
That's a very philosophical way to put it. It reminds me of Foucault's ideas about power being both repressive and productive.
Uh-huh.
Like, it limits our choices, but it also shapes our very identities.
That's a great connection. And Bauer challenges other feminist philosophers to be more self-reflective about the role of their own work in these debates.
Okay.
She asks whether their critiques of pornography are actually contributing to meaningful social change or just remaining abstract theoretical exercises.
So it's not just about analyzing the world, it's about how that analysis feeds back into the world and potentially shapes it. It's about the relationship between theory and practice, a classic philosophical concern.
Precisely. And she suggests that sometimes feminist critiques of pornography might unintentionally reinforce the very norms and stereotypes they're trying to challenge.
How could that happen?
Well,
I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that.
she argues that by focusing solely on the harms of objectification, feminists might inadvertently perpetuate a mind-body dualism
Okay.
that devalues the body and physical experience. It's like we're saying the body is inherently bad or dangerous, which plays into a lot of traditional patriarchal narratives.
So it's about being careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
Yeah.
We can critique harmful forms of objectification without denying the importance of embodiment and physical pleasure. There's a need for a more holistic perspective.
Exactly. And the source material also challenges us to think beyond the traditional framework of objectification when analyzing sex work.
Okay.
It mentions philosopher Anne Cahill,
Okay.
who argues that the concept of objectification itself might be the wrong tool for understanding the complexities of these interactions.
That's intriguing. Why does she think that?
Cahill argues that accounts of objectification often rely on this hierarchical view of the self where the mind is privileged over the body.
Okay.
It's a classic Cartesian split, you could say. And she suggests that this framework can't fully capture the experiences of those who might find pleasure and empowerment in being treated as a sexually appealing body.
So she's saying that it's possible to embrace one's physicality and sexuality without necessarily being reduced to a mere object.
Yes.
That there's a way to experience desire and embodiment that doesn't negate one's subjectivity or agency.
That's the nuance she's bringing to the conversation. And she proposes an alternative framework focusing on the concept of derivatized subject.
Derivatized subject.
Yeah.
I've never heard that term before.
It's a concept she develops to describe a specific kind of degradation that goes beyond objectification.
Okay.
She argues that we degrade others not just by treating them as bodies, but by treating them in a way that reduces their subjectivity to the roles they fulfill for us.
Okay.
So a derivatized subject is someone who's only valued for the specific functions they serve for another person, rather than being seen as a fully realized individual with their own desires and motivations.
So in the context of sex work, a derivatized subject would be a sex worker who's seen solely as an instrument for fulfilling a client's sexual desires without any regard for their own thoughts, feelings, or aspirations.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the full humanity and complexity of each person rather than reducing them to a single role or function.
Right.
And Cahill argues that we need to find ways to ensure that sex work doesn't involve this kind of derivatization, recognizing the full personhood and agency of sex workers.
It's a powerful challenge to traditional views of sex work, pushing us to consider the nuances of power agency and subjectivity in these complex interactions. It's clear that there are no easy answers here, and that any approach to these issues needs to be grounded in a deep respect for the dignity and autonomy of all individuals involved.
Well said, and I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into feminist perspectives on sex markets.
Yeah.
These are debates that will likely continue for a long time to come, and it's important to approach them with open minds, a willingness to listen to different perspectives, and a commitment to seeking solutions that promote justice and well-being for everyone.
I couldn't agree more. This has been an incredibly thought-provoking journey, and I feel like I've gained a much deeper understanding of the philosophical and ethical complexities surrounding these issues.
We hope you have too, dear listener. Remember, these conversations are not just academic exercises, they have real-world implications. So keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us.